Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Tharoor. I'd just like to start off with the elephant in the room, which is you've previously expressed concerns about China's response to the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, how do you think India is handling the epidemic and outbreak as it stands, especially under Modi's government?
Well, I have mixed feelings about the Indian response as well. First of all, being a federal country, some states have handled it better than others. I think, for example, my home state of Kerala, which had the first cases who happened to be medical students returning from Wuhan, handled it very well. The whole WHO formula of test, treat, trace, isolate, and treat again. I mean, this is essentially the way in which Kerala has done its job. And despite the fact that it has the highest test rates in India, having tested 220 possible cases out of a million people per head of population, it's actually been able to keep fatalities down to one single soul. So that's not bad at all. In other states, I have to say, a less convincing response. The state of Bihar has tested one person per million. And Maharashtra and Delhi, which is where Bombay and Delhi are situated, are ramping up now. So we may see more impressive results there. So that's on that front. On the question of the lockdown, which was the decision taken by the Modi government that's had the most impact, I would have two critiques. And they may seem contradictory, but they're not. The first is that the decision was taken about 10 days too late to have been meaningfully effective. But secondly, it was done with too little planning. In other words, Mr. Modi gave the nation 2 days' notice before proclaiming a curfew on a Sunday, which turned out to be a trial run for the lockdown, and it went very well. And people had 2 days to brace themselves for it. Then the next day at 8 o'clock at night, he announces with 4 hours notice that the nation was going to go into a 21-day lockdown. Now, not only was that grossly inadequate as notice, but clearly the government was caught unawares by the large number of things that anyone with 5 minutes of thought could have anticipated might happen that they had not planned for. Number one, they had taken no steps to give people time to make arrangements in the course of, let's say, a 2-day, 3-day, or even 4-day period to prepare for 21 days of inactivity. Secondly, they had not done anything as a government to actually pass rules, regulations, or if necessary, laws that would tell, for example, employers that they were not going to legally fire people during that window, that they would have to pay a certain percentage of people's salaries, to tell domestic staff, factory workers and others what arrangements could be made for them, to assure people who literally lived on daily wages to have their meal that night, that the government would take charge of food, water, subsistence arrangements for such people until they were able to resume work. And finally, to tell people that those who felt obliged to return to their homes, India is a nation of migrant labor, that transport would be available for them to go home for, let's say, 2, 3, or even 4 days. Let's say if you're working in Madras and your home is a village in Bihar, you will need at least 2 days just to get there. So you needed to have given them enough notice and then locked down the country thoroughly. You would have done a far better job than this abrupt thing, which resulted in chaos, where people coming out onto the streets for essential supplies from milk to medicines were not just intercepted and barred by the police, but in many cases even beaten up. Even vigilante mobs started descending on street corners for the fun of whacking errant passers-by or motorcyclists who shouldn't have been on the road. Videos of all this were going around and gave the impression of a country in disarray. And I think this could have been avoided.
So following on from what you said, Dr. Tharoor, you mentioned in your Indian Express article that the pandemic has caused a temptation on a part of those nationalists to close themselves off to the international community because they find the opportunity to do so. I think you're spot on. But my question there is, what's the answer to the global wave of isolationism and also inward-looking nationalism? Is there more to be said than just changing the way we govern? Because it seems the whole mindset of governance, or to think that we are governing as opposed to interacting with the people, that might be a route, or at least one of the multiple routes to blame for the ongoing backlash against globalization in that sense.
Quite right. I think that's a good point. And the fact is that these ethno-nationalist populists who have come to power in more than a dozen countries around the world, big and small, clearly have done so on the backs of democratic electorates. That is, that they have actually managed to convince a majority of people that theirs is a better way than that of the sort of internationalist, rootless cosmopolitans who were creating a global system, as it were, that privileged, in the phrase of the British writer David Goodhart, the anywheres rather than the somewheres, not the people who are comfortable in business class lounges anywhere in the world versus the people who are rooted in a place, an ethnicity, a language, a religion, and so on. Now, this could be a backlash to globalization because of governance issues and failures, as you suggest. It could be a simple winners and losers calculation, that those who felt that they were losing out or had lost out from the processes of globalization decided it was time to have a bit of their own back. And it could simply be something else altogether, which we can't place a finger on, that would imply a kind of global change in the seemingly irresistible shift towards greater globalization economically and a greater pooling of sovereignties politically in order to create supranational institutions like the EU, to strengthen world bodies like the UN or the WHO. Maybe what we saw with the victories of Trump and Erdogan and Urban and Putin and Xi and Modi and the like, and even Brexit and so on, may well be a reassertion of national identities and national sovereignties, which perhaps may then mark the next phase for the next 20, 25 years. We don't know. The debate is still being held, the battle is still being waged, and we'll have to see. But certainly looked at from the perspective of today, and given the extraordinary success and control and power of all these individuals, we may well be witnessing a reversion to states throwing up barriers behind their sovereignty and running their affairs as they please with less regard to the rest of the world. It's clearly not my preferred outcome, not just because I spent a lifetime at the UN advocating the opposite, but because I genuinely believe we can get more done by actually working together. But I'm by no means the complacent assumption that I will end up on the winning side of this argument.
Well, I guess just to follow up on that, would you not say that maybe the best strategy for the cosmopolitans to reclaim ground is to absorb and to co-opt at least parts of the nationalist agenda? So the argument there is that you have certain spheres where nationalist identities are incorporated into the cosmopolitan values, and then other spheres where you ramp up the universalist, let's all come together and work together spirits that underpins the UN and EU and WHO and all of these other associations. And maybe that's just what's missing right now in terms of the narrative of cosmopolitans, that they don't seem to acknowledge. If anything, they seem to sideline local, ethnic, civic, nationalist identities there.
Except that that's easier said than done, isn't it? It's all very well if the nationalist identity, for example, to take the Indian case, is the identity that we built up and celebrated for 7 decades, one which was not only democratic, but pluralist, and which respected a multiplicity of identities, languages, political beliefs, ethnicities, and so on within one common political space. Then we would have been arguing for, internationally, what we were defending and promoting domestically. But what you're seeing with these people I've mentioned right now is that they want a national state which is much more devoted to a single ethnicity, a single religion, a single regime with a single political point of view, a single language very often, all of that. And at the same time, you are expecting them to argue for democracy and pluralism and diversity on the global stage. They're not. It's not surprising that both Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi ran on slogans of America first and India first, respectively. So if every country says me first, then you won't have a viable international cooperation, because that first will eat up, as it were, whatever share of the pie they can lay their hands on, and only be prepared to leave crumbs for others. So it's going to become a dog-eat-dog kind of internationalism, if you can even call it internationalism in that way. So that's the battle that's still being waged. Clearly, it's partly lost. And as I mentioned in that article in the Express, we've seen with the WHO that already the dominance of certain major powers in the international organizations has very seriously infringed the autonomy of the permanent secretariats of these organizations to take a different stand. I have been an advocate for some time of a single non-renewable term of sufficient duration, maybe 6 years rather than the present 5, maybe 7 years, for the heads of these organizations, so that once elected, they can actually act without fear or favor until their term expires, and they will not be beholden to powerful countries that would otherwise be in a position to permit or prevent their re-election. Unfortunately, that reform has not been adopted by anyone, but I would think that a Director General of the WHO or a Secretary General of the UN who knew that he or she was there for just the time that they were there would not necessarily need to go out of their way to act sometimes at the behest of one major power who could veto their re-election. That's the concern. But anyway, this is all very theoretical at the moment. We are in the world we are living in the situation we have. And in this situation, the nationalist, populist, state sovereignty cheerleaders are the ones who are making the loudest noise.
Now, yeah, and on that note, actually, I think that's very interesting, because it seems to me that Modi right now is incredibly popular because he conforms with exactly the waves and the zeitgeist he identified just then. And on the other hand, if following on from your diagnosis just then, Doctor, it seems that Congress has only room for pessimism with regards to its political trajectory, because if reclaiming nationalism doesn't work, if trying to win on the grounds of cosmopolitanism and also anti-populist measures doesn't work, then it does strike me that Congress at least is going to face an uphill battle for the next 2 to 3 decades. What do you think is needed in a Congress leader to perhaps revive the party's fortunes in light of its current predicaments there?
Well, I can speak for my own vision of this, but I certainly can't speak necessarily for the party officially or for its existing leadership. I think that we need a vision that actually does reclaim the best aspects of Indian nationalism. Congress was the party of Indian nationalism. The freedom movement was the Congress. And we should speak of the nationalism of that era, which was a nationalism that was inclusive, that was pluralist, that had room for people of all religions, all faiths, all regions, all languages, and affirm that that's what India was always meant to be all about. And that what the BJP is talking about is a distortion of our historical legacy and of the proud movement that gave us the independence and the constitution we cherish. Second, I think we have to absolutely connect to those who've been marginalized by the BJP's majoritarian triumphalism. And that includes not just religious minorities, but people on the margins everywhere, whether it's women, whether it's Dalits, whether it's our tribal people, whether it's the lower middle class and the poor in the slums. They have been essentially seduced to vote against their economic self-interest in the name of either national pride or national security or anti-terrorism or Hindu chauvinism, none of which puts bread on the table or food in their bellies or a salary in their pockets. And that brings us to the third major plank, which must be economic efficiency. We have a far, far, far better record in the last generation of having run the economy than the BJP has. And we would point out, you can feel as proud as you want to be of the Hindu messaging of your prime minister, but why would you want to give him another chance to keep you out of a job? You voted for him 5 years ago when he promised you a job. He still hasn't given you a job or created an economy that can generate jobs for you. You want to give 5 years more of that? Or you want to give us a chance to bring back the prosperity, the economic growth, and the management by grown-ups that characterized Congress rule for 10 years? I mean, that's the sort of messaging that we need to do. We need to be far more communicative than we have been at the national level. And we need to be far better organized at the states. At the moment, the party is very uneven. We have a very good organizational structure in states like Kerala, where I'm elected from, and a very weak organizational sector in states like Uttar Pradesh, where in many districts the party has essentially crumbled away. We need to revive that, and it can only be done by empowering and giving autonomous freedom to local leaders rather than centralizing authority in a sort of high command, which is the favored expression in the Congress party. Now, all of these are things that are easier to say than to execute, and I recognize that. But if we don't use the next 4 years that remains to us before the next general election to make these things a reality, then I'm afraid you're right. Your doomsaying prediction that we're facing not quite extinction, but increasing irrelevance over the next few decades could come to pass. I also will be honest and say that I still don't think, even if we do all of this, that we can come back to power. Did you lose me in a minute? I lost you. Anyway, I don't think we can come back to power on our own. I think we have to make common cause with other opposition parties, particularly regional parties. In turn, we should be prepared to cede some space to them while demanding from them only the recognition that we are the one national party that can stand for the values and principles on which they can all unite. But the Trinamool Congress in Bengal, the Nationalist Congress in Maharashtra, the YSR Congress of the Telugu Desam in Andhra Pradesh, the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi, the Samajwadi Party and the Bahujan Samaj Party in Uttar Pradesh, the RJD in Bihar. These are all parties with significant standing of their own, which have their own organizational structure, their own party workers, and their own effective regional presence. None of them, and I've even left out a few others, the DMK in Tamil Nadu, for example, or the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra, none of them has any significant effect or influence outside one state. Whereas we, whether we win or lose everywhere. And therefore we have something more of a national credibility. If we could put them together on a common platform, and the time to start is now by building up an alliance in Parliament, we could well move forward, it seems to me, into mounting a credible challenge to the BJP next time, because people who may be skeptical about any one of our parties will be obliged to accept that collectively we can make the difference we need to make.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor. I'll take over from Brian. And just a short introduction, I'm Prateek Joshi. I'm in the history department under Professor Faisal Devji. And I'll be looking into the foreign policy. That's my research on. And based on the intersection of the international and what the Congress party has been up to, I have three questions for you, which may not be really pleasant ones, but definitely they are the ones I want to. I would request you. The first question is the present political discourse seems to have stagnated in a way that the opposition parties or the critical voices have constructed their criticism in the very same binary the BJP has utilized to win over the people. For instance, while the BJP has been saying that it's a battle between the national and the anti-national forces, that's how they have divided. The Congress or the other people, who are critical of the BJP, they are saying it's a battle between secularism and fascism. Now, don't you feel that this categorization restricts engagement with critical issues on a deeper level, and whether at all the strategy is enough to influence the political discourse which the Congress wants to? Because there's no intersection of key themes in this binary.
I would agree with you only partly. We are also making other substantive arguments that seem to get no traction in the mainstream media reporting. For example, we have consistently articulated an economic critique of the government, which seems to get absolutely no attention in the media. So when you focus on the debates that we're talking about, yes, we are talking about those things, but that's the only stuff the media is interested in reporting. We're also talking, for example, about the government's gross mismanagement of the economy, about its manipulation of petrol prices to gouge the traveling public, the Aam Aadmi, as we would say in our discourse, in order to meet their revenue deficits and their fiscal deficit. We've talked about for example, woeful public spending on both health and education. So, for example, one of my personal arguments, I've actually hosted a seminar as far back as 3 or 4 years ago on the mysterious question of why no election has been won or lost on the issue of health. Our public hospitals are an abomination in most states, and the central government's resource allocation is pathetic. 1.28% of our GDP, even today, is spent on health, which is criminally shameful. And maybe as a result of COVID, we can get a renewed impetus to demand a complete reallocation of resources so that more goes to health and less to other things. Similarly, on the environment, I've been running a campaign on clean air for 3 years, which finally began to get some attention when people began to choke and sputter during the Diwali season in Delhi. But it's not that many of us have not anticipated the big issues. It's that the media is only interested in what stirs up controversy and attracts eyeballs, and health, environment, education were not deemed to be those subjects. So I would say that with the voters, we will take these issues back to them as well.
Thank you very much for this answer. My second question is, there's this newfound assertion in India's engagement with the international sphere as far as decisions regarding Pakistan or Kashmir or the larger powers like US or China, the way Mr. Jaishankar had its own way of speaking. Irrespective of their implications, the problem this creates for the Congress is that these decisions have been portrayed as course corrections or as compensations for decisions which should have been taken a long ago. Now, as a seasoned observer of the international affairs, how do you address this issue, which directly impinges on the Congress party's performance?
I mean, I would use a very impolite term and describe it as codswallop. I think that the only areas of foreign policy that have actually worked have been where the government has continued the existing foreign policy of the Congress party. In many other domains, including the very examples you mentioned, there has been either ineptitude or confusion and some serious setbacks. I think certainly the relationship with China has been incredibly confused in terms of mixed signals on both sides. You've seen ups and downs worthy of a child's yo-yo, a contrast between a sort of ostentatious public relations bromance between Mr. Modi and Mr. Xi, contrasting with substantive setbacks on everything from access to the Chinese market on the one hand to the border standoff, including the Chinese presence in Doklam on the other, to the ridiculous trade imbalance, which has got worse during Mr. Modi's regime, etc., etc. There is, on the one hand, you have one kind of signaling, on the other hand, you have this kind of result. Similarly with America, we have managed the extraordinary feat of taking what had been a very successful bipartisan relationship, and this government has reduced it to one where it's Republicans who love Mr. Modi and Democrats who dislike him, which is an element of partisanship in Indo-US relations that has never existed before. How can you possibly claim that Indo-US relations are in a good place? And on top of that, Mr. Trump's trade war against India on tariffs and so on has found the Indian government floundering. If you look at any other part of our crucial relationship, Pakistan comes to mind as another major embarrassment where the signaling has been all over the place and where there is nothing tangible to show in 6 years of mismanaged relations. And the neighborhood, which is so crucial to India, because a peaceful periphery is extremely important to any regional power. We have had adverse setbacks in almost every one of our neighbors. We've been lucky that in Bangladesh we have a power that is sympathetic to us, but even there the government has needlessly offended friendly elements in Bangladesh with its domestic rhetoric against Bangladeshi immigrants. And you've seen similar things going on with our comments on domestic policies in Sri Lanka, in Nepal. Bhutan, as a result of becoming a democracy, is much more openly willing to challenge some of the sacred assumptions of its relations with us. Maldives, we went through a very, very bad period until fortunately we had the election of a government that was friendly to India. But that was nothing that the Indian government could engineer. So in every respect, I think we have to accept that this government's foreign policy has been inept. And I would recommend to you the section of my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, that discusses this in somewhat more detail.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor. And my last question is regarding this, the whole question of secularism, which is being hotly debated So, as the opposition or the critical voices, they charge that the BJP is to blame for the present communal polarization. What do you have to say on the fact that the party's vote share increased and people, despite whatever it's there, it's black and white, but the people decided to vote for the BJP. So my question on this thing is that do we really need a new debate on the idea of secularism and the state's relationship with all the religions? Because unlike Europe, religious identity is very much part of people's own identities. We carry it on our sleeves: Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and they come in conflict. Now, we should not be happy and rosy about the fact that India has been a democracy. It is a democracy, but the fact that in personal interactions, in local politics, identities are very much debated. And as distant watchers, we do have some romanticist ideas about it. But yes, identities are something, they are issues which are a matter of politics and debate and consternation. Thank you.
Well, I mean, the fact is very simply that as I just got through talking to, giving an interview in French and explaining the difference between the French laïcité and our secularism. Our secularism really is a misnomer. It was always the wrong word, and which is why partially it didn't occur in the Constitution till 76. What it was actually a celebration of pluralism. And Pratik, you're quite right. There was an acknowledgement of multiple identities. But the word multiple was as important as the word identities. The idea was that Indians were secure in having their own identities, whether religious or caste or linguistic or regional or ethnic, provided they accepted that they're all sheltered under the carapace of the common identity that was Indian. My metaphor, which now I've been using for 25 years, that actually I applied to this was the metaphor of the Indian thali. That unlike the American melting pot, we were a thali made up of different dishes in different bowls. Each bowl had a distinctive taste. Because each dish was in a bowl, it didn't flow necessarily into the next. But they belonged together on the same platter and they combined on your palate to give you a satisfying repast. That was the Indian experience, exactly the opposite of the American melting pot. And to my mind, what we are seeing now is a threat to that kind of secularism. At no stage did Indian secularism require you to forget your identity. It just required you to accept that your identity need not clash with other identities. You, be yourself. If you want to promote your own cause, you're welcome to do so. Within the rules, the common ground rules of our democracy. In a large democracy, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree and how you will express your differences, how you will express your identities, and how you will resolve them. So this is something that we had done very effectively for 70 odd years. And what the BJP government has done, you said slightly innocently, the people have supported. How many people? The BJP won its first election with 31% of the vote, its second election with 34% of the vote. Now you tell me that's the merit, if you like, of the Westminster first past the post system in fragmented constituencies with multiple opposition parties dividing the remaining 69%. But where do you get the notion that a majority shares the BJP's Hindutva view? I don't feel that at all. And even if a significant percentage does, it is only in northern India. I live and work and campaign and speak in the south, and I see none of the his chip on the shoulder about Muslims that some Hindus in North India bear. I see no fertile ground for the kind of soft bigotry or hard bigotry being signaled by the BJP orators in their speeches. I see absolutely no receptivity to marginalize Muslims or any other community. I see no sense of acceptance of the presumption of the BJP that India is in essence, first of all, a Hindu state, and only secondly, a state for everybody else, and that the others are here on sufferance as the guests or the invitees of the Hindus, which is the way in which the Hindutva movement sees non-Hindus. Now, all of that is simply, it is a recipe for dividing the country. It is a recipe for threatening the very idea of India. I mean, it's the idea of India, and I'm already prefiguring to you the theme of my next book, which is on Indian nationalism. And I'm just working on it now. But the idea of India is precisely one that is important, not just because it's a warm, fuzzy, liberal idea that you guys sitting abroad can applaud from your common rooms in Oxford, or whatever you call them. It's actually the most efficient and practicable idea for organizing and running a diverse democracy. And that the moment you depart from this, you actually threaten the very basis of the Indian nation itself. So I think it's very important to understand that what I'm talking about is not just fuzzy-headed liberalism. It is a very strong, passionate, practical argument to preserve the Indian nation as we have built it and developed it and protected it for 70 years.
Just to pick up on that, actually, because I think that's fascinating, Dr. Tharoor. Might I suggest that you might perhaps be putting, or we might be putting the cart before the horse here, though, in that we keep talking about the Indian nation and the nation of India as a nation of idea. But would a nationalist not be able to say maybe this is precisely the argument for a more devolved, even more libertarian and locality and provincial politics driven form of Indian politics, where you don't go for sort of multiculturalist nation, you don't go for state building, you just let the natural course of each province or each state's imaginary of politics take its course, i.e., I'm not advancing this, but I suggest that some might say splintering or secession within India is not a bad or as bad an idea as it might seem on surface. And therefore, it is not a democracy to preserve, but instead multiple states that we ought to embrace the natural devolution into.
Well, I happen to believe in a united India that's larger than the sum of its parts. And I think it's actually worked reasonably well. If you think of where India was in 1947, in every possible indicator, whether it's the poverty line, the British left us with 90% of the population below the poverty line, whether it's life expectancy, the British left us with a life expectancy of 27, whether it's literacy, the British left us with 13% literacy, and so on and so forth. The collective Indian state did a pretty good job of addressing every one of those problems over 7 decades. So the point is that as long as it were to continue as a state in which everybody felt an equal share, an equal stake, an equal opportunity to flourish, this would continue to be a good, effective, efficient solution. But certainly an attempt to impose a unitary Hindi, Hindutva, Hindustan model on India would actually be extremely dangerous, because there will be then a lot of voices rising saying, why the hell do we have to take this? This is not our experience. This is not our value system. We don't need to swallow this. So my argument is that if you like, the politics, the easygoing politics that you were describing, Brian, is actually the best way of keeping India united and together in the interests of all. And the hardline pursuit of uniformity will actually destroy unity. But that's a theme I'm going to develop in my forthcoming book, which should be out before the end of the year if I use this lockdown effectively and don't spend all of it on video with you guys. So maybe we should resume this conversation a year from now, or 6 or 9 months from now, when we'll have something more concrete to argue with or against.
That is very fair.
We've done 40 minutes. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you very, very
Thank
much.
you very much, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you very much.